Suzanne Stone. I am the Chief Strategic Solutions and Programs Officer at the Livestrong Foundation. When people say, "What do you do for a living?" in the elevator, I say, I do nonprofit for a living. So that is my career. I've been in nonprofit for over 25 years. I've worked for both small and large nonprofits, court-appointed special advocates, the Children's Miracle Network. I've worked for an education foundation. I've worked for public access television stations, the mother of YouTube. You can Google that. You will need to. I've also worked for the Susan G. Komen Foundation, and most recently, I'm still in the Livestrong role. I sit on a board as well of a small nonprofit in my community. So I believe in scale and impact, and so when I move jobs or I'm looking for new projects or programs to take on, I am really focused on that strategic scaling of impact, and that's what I'm most passionate about, and I am a people person. So that's why all my nonprofits are people. Nonprofits. just are.
The thing about philanthropy that I really like, to kind of get there, I'll tell my very first story of why nonprofit. So I graduated from TCU, fellow frogs. So the most important part was the TCU frog part, but I graduated from TCU with a degree in radio, television, and film production, which has absolutely nothing to do with what I do. But it actually does, and I'll tell you why. So I went into television. It was a mean business, and I did that for a few years, and I needed to get out. It just wasn't a heart fit for me, you know? When you do something just wasn't really rewarding. But what my favorite part was telling stories. And that's what I did. I wrote, I edited, I produced, and my goal was to make people laugh or cry or act in every story that I told through television. And so when I left the television industry, I had to get a job doing something I knew how to do. And so I kept looking for television jobs that were somehow different. And that's where I found public access. And public access was this baby idea that this mother cable was going to come, and she was going to control what we could all watch in communities. And so as cable was growing, the federal government, the FCC was saying, oh, you've got to have 3 stations in every community. You've got to have your government access, your education access, and your public access. Public access is where I landed, and I taught people in the community how to make television shows. It was a nonprofit, but that didn't really register with me at the time. About a year in, a woman comes up to me and says, "Suzanne, you have changed my life." Like, what did I do? I taught you how to plug in audio cables. Like, what are you talking about? And she said, no, you taught me how to create my quilting show. And then you put it on the air, and people watch it, and now they're coming to me all the time, and I'm making quilts, and my business is booming, the mother of YouTube. And that made me feel really good, that I didn't even know I was doing something, but I was hooked on that feeling of impact, that all I did was my job, and I changed this person's life. So that is why nonprofit. Once you, at least for me, that initial feeling is saying, oh, I have to do this always. I want to keep doing that. So thus my career. I've never left the nonprofit field, although I've attempted a couple of times unsuccessfully, because I keep getting drawn back into impact. Large philanthropy versus small philanthropy, I think, is a really interesting choice. I think about, like I said, impact and scale. So small philanthropy is not bad philanthropy, but you have to understand the scope and be comfortable with it. Sometimes you don't need to grow, right? I know a lot of you found nonprofits that you're advocating for that are smaller. And a lot of questions I heard today were, well, what are they going to do to expand? I'm not saying that's a bad question to ask, but maybe the question is, do they need to? Do they need to in order to continue their mission? Maybe they don't. Maybe staying small is the answer. When you work for a small nonprofit, you take out the trash, literally. You put on all the events, you unload U-Hauls, you call donors, you cook food, you do everything when you work for a small nonprofit. When you work for a big nonprofit, you take out the trash, you load U-Hauls. There is no real difference in the work day because you do everything. And that's what makes, in my mind, nonprofit pretty special culturally, as opposed to a for-profit model. When considering a career in nonprofit, you got to be all in. And because everybody there in your work is going to be all in. And I think you've all had the same experience, would be my guess. Because if you haven't taken out the trash, you've never worked with me. So I've had a few jobs. And I've hired a whole lot of people. I've also let a few people go. So my insight would be from the nonprofit side, when you're coming out of school and you're looking, saying, yeah, maybe I want to do that. Maybe I want to be on the nonprofit side as opposed to the funder side. And yes, funding, and I've done both, and I continue to do both. I write grants and I give money away. So I'm asking and giving it away right now, both sides. So I think there are a couple things you can do. One, I would suggest that you volunteer with the organization that you're really passionate about, but not just one, because one experience doesn't teach you different ways to run that business. So I think that that's really valuable. I say everybody's either a plant, a person, or an animal. That's how you can decide your philanthropy. I'm a person, right? All my work has been with people. If you love the environment, go find yourself some environmental, what is that environment issue, right? If you're an animal, go find a couple dog shelters, whatever it is, right? Do some volunteer work. Get to know people who are on the board. Get to know people who work there. See if you even want to be involved before you apply for a job there, because you will not like it. You may hate your job, and no, it doesn't matter how much impact you have, right, if you don't like where you work. So do a little bit of groundwork first, I would suggest. And then the people. Now you know the people. And especially at low-level nonprofits and those smaller nonprofits, easy to get a job because turnover is pretty high. So you'll get a job pretty fast doing whatever. Take a job doing whatever. Other duties as assigned, and I think I wrote this in the book, that is everybody's job description. It's just other duties as assigned. So take whatever it is. If that's the nonprofit you want to work for, take the job that you don't really want just so you can get in the door, and you will have the job you want in like 20 minutes. I think the other way to do it is not to work for a nonprofit. Instead, go take these amazing brains that you have and go out into the for-profit field and kill it. And then start a family foundation and hire her to run it. But that's another way, right? Then now you start volunteering and you get to be on the board of directors. And then you have influence how that favorite nonprofit of yours functions. And you start giving, and pretty soon you're like, person of the year in your community. But you're having just as much impact because you're giving money to the organization that you are so passionate about, and you have say, to your point, about how that money is spent because you're a big investor into that nonprofit. So that's what I would say. In my opinion, there are two ways to be involved in philanthropy and to get a job in philanthropy. Just to add to all of that, my friend Lance Slaughter, who works at ALS, says, nonprofit begins where government ends. So no matter where that line is, that's what happens, right? And so to your point about that, that fluctuation of government taking that step back, then you see philanthropy stepping up to fill in, much like community and schools, right? When I was sitting in that room, it's the only reason I say that. Much like that, right? So there's a situation where philanthropy has come to say, well, we've got to do more. These kids need our help, whatever that is. And then I think, so the question on what are the challenges today and what the future of it, I think we look back in the last 30, 40 years, and I used to know these numbers by heart, and I think it's over $300 billion every year donated to philanthropy. And yet you go back in history, and those numbers keep going up, right? I mean, philanthropic giving is rising, continues to rise, and yet you do not see Food insecurity drop. You do not see homelessness drop. You don't. Go track every social cause, and nothing has changed. Statistically significant change. And that's so frustrating, but there's a huge opportunity. And I think that COVID, which was awful, I'm so glad it's almost over. But I think that we have this collaboration piece that, I think has been kind of this common thread that we've heard a lot about today, and these new revenue models, exactly what you're talking about. We have this real opportunity to change the way philanthropy looks today, to actually make statistical impact when we have these giant funders, like you're talking about, like Gates and Bezos and Buffett, who have amassed this wealth. And maybe there's a different way for us to make impact that actually can move the needle on some of the globe's most systemic problems. And I think you're totally right. There have been a lot of really great things. I mean, it's not like it's
as
all
a direct
doom and
result
doom.
of philanthropic.
Absolutely, 100%. 100%. In fact, I think the Gates Foundation is a really interesting model that I could talk about for hours. Yeah. I love how they think when it comes to funding, right? And they actually look for root causes, and that's where they're making significant impact. I'm just saying, future philanthropy on its face, the whole,
Sure.
right, hasn't done statistically enough for the amount of money that has been given year over year over year. I think it's also interesting how, applying for grants right now is very, very different. Not very, very, but it is very different than it was just a year ago, right? So right now, a lot of funders have DEI statements, and they are looking at the makeup of your board of directors, and they want to see diversity, and they want to see statements, and we've never had to do that before in all the nonprofits I've had. That's in all the grants I've ever written. That's, yes, we've all, you have to list your board members, but I don't think anybody was really looking. I really don't think so. But today it is absolute, and you're getting turned down at the entry point if you don't meet those standards that the funder is looking for. So I think that's a big shift in philanthropy that we will continue to see and will continue to influence, to your point, right? Kind of continue to influence who gets the money and how nonprofit organizations look. I think if I were a director of development at a university right now, I'd be a little anxious, but I think it has to start at the board level, at the university level, which will probably be historically not super diverse. And so, if you all go back and look at the board, you probably don't have any idea who's on the board of your school. Probably not. So I think that's one thing that the board has to do a lot of work, not just at universities and arts organizations, but I think that those are good examples where we talk about wealth distribution, and so you're going to see a lot of wealth sitting in those areas. So boards at all levels need to take a look inside and say, what do we look like? Do we reflect the community that we're serving, and do we look like our students? Do we look like our patrons? I don't know. Ultimately, I think what you see is that your students or your patrons look like the board, right? Probably, because they're driving policy. It's like driving philanthropy, right? So I think if I were the director of development at a university or an arts institution, I would really be encouraging my board to do a deep look inside, make some changes there, make sure that we're investing in programs, and I would be looking for grant money to go. I would go to those professors and say, where can we do better? What programs already exist in our school? Where can we diversify? Where can we add some curriculum, whether it's an art side or a humanities, wherever? Where can we add to the conversation? And I think that's where funding will come. That's what I would do.